different reasons to worry about invasive plant species. And he mentioned wildlife habitat. If you like native birds, it's good to have native plants to feed them and fuel the food webs. Tick and Lyme disease is another one. Aesthetically, they can just be really ugly, especially in the wintertime as they're blanketing trees and just looking dead and gross. And then why we're here today, forest health is definitely a really important thing to think about when we're thinking about invasive plants. That work? Great. All right. So quick overview of some of the basic terms as far as invasive plant species go. Natives, if I'm using the word native, I'm referring to anything that was pretty much here before humans brought plants from Europe and Asia. And because of that, they have adapted with the other wildlife in the area. Non-native is then the opposite, anything that was brought in either intentionally or accidentally to an area, to a region, and not all of them are problematic. A lot of our agricultural species are not native, but they're not taking over the areas surrounding them, so we don't worry about them. When we get to invasive, we are talking about non-native species whose introduction is causing a problem. Generally, it's also harming us economically, environmentally, or even potentially harming human health. And then aggressive plants, this can refer to native or non-native species. Generally, anything that we're referring to as a non-native invasive species is because it's also very aggressive. But something like a cattail would be an example of a native species that is also very aggressive. So it might become problematic in certain situations, but it is native and it is providing wildlife habitat and things like that. All right. So any of these might also be considered a weed, which is a plant that's growing in a place where you don't want it to be. These are just to the next level of horrible weeds. All right. So there are a lot of common traits that invasive plant species have that cause them to be a problem. They're brought here, and then they tend to multiply and spread really quickly. Often this is because they don't have the predators that they would have had in their native. There's nothing to keep them in check. They usually create a lot of seeds. Often those seeds are viable for a really long time, and they have great strategies for spreading. Whether it's wind, they often float, and then they can be taking over a large area in a short period of time. They often also start creating their seeds really young. So maybe it only takes them a year or two to start creating seeds, whereas a native version of that plant, might take them 10 years before they get around to actually starting to create any seeds. They're generally really adaptable. They might live in or be able to survive in a really shady area all the way up to a really sunny area. They can tolerate different soil conditions, different moisture conditions, so they're very adaptable. These are really interesting, really hardy, fascinating plants. But you put them in the wrong place, they start outcompeting the natives and creating a lot of problems. So another bonus they have going for them over a lot of our native species is that often they are evergreen or semi-evergreen, and they have a lot longer growing season to start to outcompete and start bullying out the natives around them. And deer is a really strong connection with a few of these things, where the deer might browse and eat the natives. They don't do that to kind of reduce the growth of the non-natives. A lot of them are also thorny, so they're just not really that appealing. But then a lot of these have berries and seeds that deer and mammals and birds in our area do like to eat, and then they help to spread those seeds that way. So they're hitting us from a lot of different sides. These are just a few resources. Some of them are being passed around the room right now for how you might be able to identify and learn information about how to control these species. These three that I have up here are all on your little green sheet. You can get them as a PDF online, and the largest one in the center there, which is a brown copy that's going around, there's two versions. There's the larger booklet that's focused on identification, and the smaller booklet that goes into a little bit of identification but is more focused on how to actually manage and control those species. Both of those you can get online, but you can also ask to be sent a copy, and they'll send you a copy for free depending on if they have enough in print right now. So that's kind of one of my favorite resources right now to be able to share. So I'm going to just quickly go into a little bit of information about how to identify some of these species. And identification is kind of your best strategy for controlling them. If you don't know they're there, you don't know you have a problem, you can't do anything about it. And now is a really good time of year to do some assessment and see what you might have. Because a lot of these things, I said, they leaf out earlier than our native species. And if you catch them in the next week or two, you might see them before our native species have their leaves on them. And you can start to locate them and know where you might want to target some efforts. So I'm going to go through some of the different categories of plants and some of the similarities they have, and then a few of each species in those categories. So with invasive trees, like others, they grow and mature rapidly. They often displace native plants. They act like bullies, and they keep those other natives from being able to grow in the forest. They compete for light, water, and nutrients, and then they generally create a lot of seeds and spread that way. And then the majority of them can also spread vegetatively. So if you cut down one, maybe the roots are going to just send up that many more sprouts and create more trees, causing a larger problem. Ailanthus, or tree of heaven, we don't see that on the eastern shore quite as much as we see it, especially around urban areas and the woods that surround them. But I just wanted to mention it because since we don't see too many of them, if you do see it, you want to get it out really early. And if you do have them, this is definitely one of the ones you don't want to just say, okay, I found one, I'll cut it down and I'll solve my problem. This one will come back far worse than you ever had it before if you simply cut one down. So this is definitely one that needs to be treated by a chemical if you are going to cut it so that you don't have regrowth coming from there. So this, just a couple of quick ID features. They have a compound leaf. It looks similar to a sumac or a walnut, but if you look closely at the leaf, like the bottom of the picture here, there's a little lobe on the bottom of each leaflet, and it has a little like pimple-like gland at the base of it. If you break off a leaf and you smell the inside or crush a leaf, it smells like rotten peanut butter. Not that I've ever smelled rotten peanut butter, but I think that's what it would smell like. It's a really kind of funky smell that can help you if you're not sure if you should worry about this tree or not, to focus on that. And then there are also pictures of the flower top center, and the seeds, they have a kind of a twisted winged seed that grow in clusters like that. And that's what you're looking for. Callery pear. Who has never seen a callery pear? No one. These are flowering right now. I keep going back and forth with the weird weather we're having. I'm hoping that our native plants won't be bothered too badly, but that these are really going to get hit by whatever weird storm we have coming next week. So they do have their white flowers before they get their leaves, so they're really obvious, really easy to see right now. These were brought here as a landscape species. They were the perfect tree, and they were grown to be sterile, so they weren't going to be a problem at all. They hybridized with other pear species, which most pear species will tend to do that, and now they do make viable seeds. They look like these little small balls, brown pears. They grow in big clusters, and then they're spread by birds and mammals. And you get a situation like you see down there next to the roadway where none of those trees were planted, but they're great colonizers, and they will quickly take over a meadow or something like that, and suddenly you have a forest of pear. And the new growth of these tend to be very thorny and very difficult to get into and remove if they do start growing and causing problems. So another good one to watch out for. They are still sold and produced for landscaping, so if you can ever encourage folks not to plant them, that's definitely the way to go. And watch out for them if you do have these in your neighborhood, which you usually do. A lot of these plants also seek out disturbance. So anytime you're disturbing the soil on your property, make sure you're protecting that area, whether you're mulching it, seeding it, whatever you can do to make sure that these aren't going to happen. The mulberry is on your left. The mimosa is on the right of the screen there. The mulberry has the white mulberry, excuse me. There are a couple of different kinds of mulberries, and they will hybridize as well. They do have a berry that's edible by humans. A lot of people like them for that. And they have a leaf that can either be deeply lobed or not lobed at all. and you can see the kind of large teeth around the edges of the leaf. They are also spread by birds and generally tend to be placed right over parking spaces and areas you want clean, so that all those nice dark purple berries will fall, and then the birds will give you really nice deep dark purple poo all over your vehicles. If that's not a good enough reason to get rid of them, I don't know what is. And then the Mimosa silktree, beautiful flower, smells great, flowers for a long time during the summer months. But I'm starting to see it in larger and larger clusters, and you can really tell it obviously when it's flowering. In the summertime, you can see them and see them starting to bully out things around them. Invasive shrubs, I think, are that much more problematic than the trees because these start to take over the understory of a forest, and then again, it's another way that we don't have the regeneration of our canopy trees. So they really tend to mess with the plant succession in a forest and keeping them healthy that way. Like the trees, they're often spread quickly by other animals. Most of these that I'll mention have a really tempting berry that the birds and deer and mice will spread around for you. A lot of those berries are not the same wildlife or habitat quality. They're maybe the equivalent of going to eat fast food over, some great salads and healthy foods. So the birds aren't necessarily getting the sources of food that they would from the natives, but they get like a high energy or a high sugar punch from these berries, and they very generously spread the seeds around with them. So these plants can tend to change the nutrient cycling in the soil and the soil chemistry, as well as the hydrology and a lot of different things. And even just the growth habit and the way the branches are arranged on these bushes can be problematic for nesting birds, and they can also shelter rodents, which tends to increase our population of ticks and Lyme and other tick-borne diseases. So this one is a big culprit in that. This is Japanese barberry. It has small paddle-shaped leaves. Those little kind of yellowish white flowers dangle from underneath it. They're leafing out right now. They'll flower soon after they get their leaves. And they have little needle-like singular thorns on them. You can see the red kind of oval oblong berry that they carry through the winter. They can drop down and create new plants underneath them and then spread throughout the forest as the animals eat them and deposit them. And these can grow in your shadiest of woods and then in patches of sun too. And they can really cause a problem in the understory. And I have my little tick picture on here because these are one of the main culprits. Their leaves grow so densely, they keep really nice, moist area underneath them, even in the hottest times of the summer when other areas might be drying out a lot more quickly, and the ticks love that. So they can survive underneath those areas, and they've been doing a lot of interesting research on this and finding that not only are there higher populations of ticks where you have things like the barberry, but more of those ticks tend to have Lyme. So this is another one spread a lot by landscape, continue to be planted as a landscape species. I'm trying to race through these so I can have time to get to everything. Here's your autumn olive. This one's an easy one. You can identify it driving 65 miles an hour down the road by the silvery look that the leaves have. So there are these silver kind of lentil scales all over the underside of the leaves and on the berries and on the stem. So it's that silveriness of these that you can see. This one actually does produce a fruit that's edible. I know people who make jam from this in the fall, and I've tasted it. It's pretty good. The more you can do things like that, the less the seeds are going to be eaten by the birds and spread. But the birds are probably going to get there first and do their job with that. These were also intentionally planted. They were used a lot as even wildlife food. And then they have spread, and they'll take over a field and the edge of the woods very quickly. Privet. Here's another one that there are many different kinds of. They can be semi-evergreen or evergreen. Again, planted as a landscape species, and then thanks to the birds and the wind and everything else, have spread into the edges of the woods and further. So they have opposite leaves. So they can either be evergreen, or they might lose some or all of their leaves in the winter, depending on what kind it is. and they'll get those kind of currant-sized, dark bluish, blackish purple berries on them that help them to spread around. They do have a attractive white flower, which is one of the other reasons why people like to plant them in their yards. But then, just like all these others, they cause large problems when they get out and start spreading themselves around. They are really easy to pull when they're young. So if you can get to them first, and I often see them even just around my yard, coming up under and around trees and along fence lines, since that's where the birds will perch and deposit the seeds, and then they'll start popping up there. So it's a good one to just kind of keep an eye out for, know what they look like when they're babies, and just grab them out before they can become a larger problem. I just wanted to mention also, a lot of us do have these species in our yards or our neighbors' yards, and maybe you're willing to cut it down and replace it with something else. That's fantastic. That's a great thing to do. If you're not, or if it's not yours, but you can either cut off the berries or encourage someone else to do so, especially in these ones where the berries aren't really the most attractive part of the plant, that's a really great way to help keep them from spreading off onto other areas where we don't want them to. And then there are also a lot of different kinds of shrub honeysuckle. They might be hard to tell one from the other, but we don't have any native shrub honeysuckle, so you don't have to worry about it. If you find a shrub honeysuckle, it's not something you want to have around. They generally have an orange or a red berry, and the flowers can kind of vary from one to the other. Some look very much like the vine honeysuckle. Some look a little bit different. And they create these there's usually 2 flowers right across from each other on the stem, and therefore 2 berries right across from each other on the stem. And this is another one that has kind of an oval entire leaf, and they're opposite. So all the leaves are growing right across from one another on the stem too. All right. Multiflora rose. This is probably another one that nobody in the room has ever seen before, right? Another fun one to tackle, since it is covered with thorns. They're generally kind of a hook-shaped, or maybe a little bit like a shark fin-shaped thorn. One way to tell this apart from our natives, or 2, if it's flowering and it's white, it's not one of our native roses. And if it has, I don't know how to work the laser pointer on here, but bottom middle picture, you can see there are little kind of hairy, feathery growths along the base of the leaves. Those are called the stipules. And if you see those, that's not something that our native roses tend to have. So that's a good way of telling them apart and knowing that's one you want to control. And generally, our native roses don't take over the world. And there's a swamp rose that tends to grow in thick thickets, but that definitely has a pink flower, and you're only going to see it in a really wet area, whereas these will grow wet to a much drier zone as well. And then that's the red rose hip that they create after their flowers that has the seeds in them that helps them to spread. All right. So if shrubs are worse than the invasive trees, then vines are worse than the invasive shrubs. So the vines actively kill the mature trees. So if you're not ready to go out and tackle all of the shrubs that are out there that might be causing a problem, definitely, as was mentioned before, keep an eye out for the vines and try to keep them under control. Now, of course, there are also native vines, and most of our native vines are not problematic for our trees. So poison ivy, while we might not like it, it's a native, and it does a lot of good things. So if it's not in an area where you're going to come in contact with it, leave it alone. It should be fine. There's Virginia creeper. That's a really pretty red one in the fall. That one's also great. And native grape. And if you don't have stressed trees, none of those are going to just bully and kill a tree. They've all kind of adapted together again, and so they should be fine. When we're talking about invasive vines, they will girdle your tree. They will grow up over the canopy of the tree and block its sunlight, and they will add weight to the tree. And so when we get windstorms, ice storms, snowstorms, our deciduous trees that lose their leaves intentionally so they don't have to deal with all of that snow on top of them can't handle it if they have these vines on top of them that add all that weight and wind resistance. So they'll come down really easily in a storm if they're covered in vines. And then as the tree is taken down, it opens up this great light gap in the forest, which is part of a natural succession of a forest. But when you have all these invasive seeds surrounding that, that just gives them a great opportunity and some disturbed soils and extra sunlight so that they can get that hold and take over before the natives might even have a chance. And so again, just like the previously mentioned shrubs, a lot of these vines have a berry that's eaten by birds and spread around, or they just can drop so many seeds at a time that they really start taking over quickly. So porcelainberry, I live in Easton, and this is kind of my vine nemesis in that area. If you know about the kudzu in the south, that's the way I feel about porcelainberry in our area. And this time of year, they haven't gotten their leaves yet, but if you look at a lot of the little fragmented areas of woods, especially along the roadsides, they're covered in this kind of wiry, sad, dead mass of the dormant vines from last year. It's really obvious to tell how big our problem is. So this is another one that has a leaf. It looks very much like a grape. Sometimes it can be deeply lobed, like the ones here on the bottom, but other times it doesn't have those lobes. So it's really sneaky. It can very easily fool someone into thinking it's our native grape. But if you look at the way the flowers and the berries grow, they don't grow in that kind of triangular drooping cluster like a grape does. They're more kind of spread out the way like a firework burst would be. And you can see the different colors on the pictures here. Their berries, as they mature, change in color, and you can have a white, a blue, a pale blue, a dark blue, a purple berry, all in the same plant, all in the same cluster. So that's where they get their name, porcelainberry. They're very pretty. They look lovely along your fence, but then as they're spread out into the forest and start killing off our trees, they're no longer really appreciated. Right. Oriental bittersweet. This is another one that's brought in not just because people wanted to grow them in their landscape, but also those orange and yellow berries look really pretty on the wreath that you put up around Halloween and Thanksgiving. But those berries on those wreaths can still continue to spread the seeds and then grow into these massive, sometimes almost braided vines. They'll grow up. They can kind of lay dormant and start growing small and slowly in the shaded areas. And then when a gap opens and the sunlight comes in, they suddenly go into this, I think, horror movie, scary-looking picture on the far side of the slide there where they will completely engulf anything underneath them. I think if you leave your car sitting around too long, you might lose it as these vines start growing up and over it. I haven't tried that yet. All right, English ivy. Now, this one's probably really easy to identify. Another one that everybody has seen before. Dark, waxy green leaf, kind of lighter white veins running through it. Used a lot for landscaping. Can look a lot like a poison ivy vine with the hairy vine that you see there, but it is evergreen. So generally, anytime throughout the year, you're going to be able to see the leaves on it, unlike poison ivy, which loses its leaves in the winter. And something really important to point out about this one, the picture on the far side of the slide there, you can see that it's starting to kind of branch out from the tree. And that's its mature phase. That's when it's going to start creating berries. So if you can get these vines before they get to that phase, you're going to be much better off at controlling them and controlling their spread. They can put out roots from any node where the leaves are coming off of. So if you're pulling it and cutting it, don't just leave it around because it can start regrowing. But definitely try to get it before it either starts growing out or if it's ground cover before it starts growing up. All right, and then Japanese honeysuckle. A favorite for kids, and maybe some of us adults too, who like to pull out that stem from the flower and get that little drop of sweet nectar. But this one is an aggressive vine that is a very small, tight, twining around trees. I see a lot of shrubs and native trees that are just girdled so quickly by these and have no chance to ever get anywhere. And something I think that's good this time of year to look out for is generally the immature leaves look almost like an oak leaf with really dark or deep lobes along the sides. As it matures, the leaf is just an oval, entire shape with no lobes in it. But I think a lot of times you can get it in that early phase when it looks like an oak leaf. As they grow, they get root systems, and they're really hard to pull, so they're harder to treat after that. And this one also gets a berry, just like the flowers, the leaves. Everything's opposite. They grow directly across from each other on the stem, and they have a little kind of blackish blueberry if you don't eat all those flowers before they get to that. I'm not really going to touch on this one too much, but Mile a Minute has a really obvious equilateral triangle shape It has thin thorns, almost like Velcro-y all along it. This one is, I'll just mention it, we don't see it as often. It's starting to become more of a problem, but it is, unlike anything else I've mentioned today, an annual. So if you can pull it before it creates its seeds, which are in those tiny little berries in that cup-shaped leaf, then you have a chance of getting ahead of that one. I'm running out of time. I'm already over time. Okay. But this one, I wanted to make sure to put this in because you probably can't memorize all these while you're looking at it, but you can go back and find the slide when they're posted. And this is a great comparison of what all those different vines look like without their leaves on them. So you can get out there and tackle them in the winter. And I suggest cutting them low at ground level, cutting it again at like a head or shoulder level so that you remove the ladder that's there. So if regrowth occurs, it can't go straight back up that same vine. And most of these also, if you can treat the cut stump, you're going to be much better off than simply cutting them. But simply cutting them at least kills anything that's growing up in the tree. All right. And I'm going to go through these really quickly because this one, I would not say that most of these herbaceous ones are worse than on the other ones that I talked about, but they're good to keep an eye out for. They are definitely problematic, and once they take hold, they're really hard to get rid of. Japanese silkgrass, it's kind of becoming ubiquitous, but if you don't have it yet, try to figure out what this one looks like and try to get to it before. This one is also an annual, so if you can get rid of it before it seeds, you have a really good chance of staying ahead of it. After that, you might be out of luck. Common reed, this one also, you see it everywhere. It likes to grow in wet soils, so we see it in ditches, in our wetlands, as sea level's rising. And it's coming up and becoming a major problem just about everywhere. Bamboo, don't ever plant it. There are tricks for how to contain it, and they all fail at some point. So this is a good one to keep after and make sure you don't introduce it if it's not already there. Wavyleaf basketgrass is one of the few that was only brought and discovered in the 90s. And only starting to become a problem. So this is another one I only mention it because if you see a grass with a leaf that has these kind of crimps, these waves all across the surface of the leaf, it's one to definitely check on and see if there's, you can get a positive ID and definitely get to it before it becomes a problem. They have the picture at the bottom there is boots that are just covered in seeds. So these seeds are very small, very sticky, and really easy to move around. These are a couple of other ones that are probably in a lot of the yards around here that can become problematic. Don't have enough time to talk about them. With all of these rule of thumb, don't plant them. If you have them and you can get rid of them, do so. Your best thing is to just be able to recognize them so you know what to go after before it becomes a big problem. Try to prevent the spread of those berries and seeds. Protect your soil, so don't leave disturbed soil unattended. That's where they really like to come up. And do your best to educate others and tell the property owners that they might be able to do something about this too. There's a lot of different types of treatments. Mechanical and chemical are the ones that are gone to most frequently, and they're often used in combination with one another. Unfortunately, there aren't very many of these invasives that you can get them once and be like, great, I'm done, I won the war. It's kind of an ongoing battle that you have to be vigilant, keep after them, and when you do remove them, you have to make sure that there's not a seed source there, and those birds will keep bringing them back. So you got to watch out for that, and do be cautious and safe as you're approaching all of these things. And then there are great resources here in the room to figure out how to get support and go from there. And I have a case study that when you find this online, you can look through it and you can see kind of how to assess and prioritize places on your landscape. All right, great, thank you.